So over the last couple days, I've been expressing my concerns with the rash of ACL injuries, Achilles tendon tears, and a thing called micro instability of the hip. And what I've encountered is an awful lot of pushback on the subject, because my statement that we need to ban mobility training with youth athletes and people in general seems to have ruffled a lot of feathers. So we should actually explore why. Mobility training is increasing the risk and most likely the occurrence of ACL tears, which, to be honest, they're expected to double by 2030. According to a new study put out by, I believe it was the Australian Institute of Sport, or somebody of that level of standard. And one of the things that we have to truly sort of sit back and think about and focus on are all the forces associated with movement, right? A lot of people don't actually know what they are, right? They're just passionate about it. They have a rudimentary understanding about structural anatomy, force, physics, and, to be honest, how it all applies together. So things we got to think about are, a translatory force, a rotatory force, a rotational force. So we got to think about those things and how they combine, right? Because as a person is running down a soccer pitch or a football pitch, if you happen to be in Europe, right? You have to think about that. When we go to change direction, what's happening to the forces, right? We have, obviously, people are familiar with acceleration. They're familiar with deceleration, change of direction, rate of force development, peak isometric strength, concentric and eccentric muscle contractions. So they understand a lot of that, but they understand it, but they don't really apply it. Now, here's where it gets kind of crazy, because now we have to throw in things like inertia, right? So inertia is the consequence of accelerated motion. So if I'm moving, or to be honest, just staying at rest, an object has inertia. But if I go to change speed, velocity, I have to think about these things. Now, it gets kind of interesting when you add in what's called the center of mass, and specifically to women. So let's think about this. Women have a lower center of mass than men. Women have an 800% higher rate of tearing their ACL. But their center of mass is lower. Why should that be a thing? Well, if we don't understand the rules of physics, right? A center of mass can also be deemed an axial point, right? So if I have an upper body and I have a lower body, right? So my lower body is going to have less distance from that center of mass than my upper body, right? Now, if I understand the principles of torque, which is a rotational force, I now have to think that way. Okay, cool. So if I have a greater distance, there's a higher probability that my upper body mass, be it my head structure, is going to be a different mass and rotational force, right? So torque is basically, as I said, that rotational force, right? So the torques are different. Now, if we start to explore the difference between what is occurring when my foot is on the ground versus my head is traveling forward. If we think about the concept of a moving wheel or a rotating wheel without slipping. So this is a concept in physics that is kind of really important for understanding how joints move and rotate on top of each other, right? Because there's kind of three scenarios we can have. We can have an object where if you're looking at a wheel and it rotates, well, in order for it to not be deemed slipping, well, if I had a point on that wheel and it rotates an equal amount, that should equal the distance you've moved from a translatory perspective. If you're moving and you're not going forward, you might want to think of that as slipping, right? So you're really kind of just spinning your wheels. You're not going anywhere. There's no forward translation. Now, this is where it gets bad. Skidding. So that would be our third option. And that's where basically there's a translatory effect with no rotation, right? Which is supposed to occur at your knee joint when you're moving. But let's say for some reason your foot is fixed on the ground. And when you start to explore the science behind, or the the physics behind it, right? So if we look at that circle, the contact point is actually going to have zero velocity. It is not actually moving. As your upper body, though, it actually has twice the speed or twice the magnitude. So if I got a foot on the ground that is not moving, and this is instantaneous, so this is really important, but ACL injuries happen instantaneously. So we got to be okay with this because that's how it is. So if I have an instantaneous not moving foot and I have an upper body that is actually moving at a greater torque, twice as fast, and that's not even part of the current conversation when it comes to ACL injuries. Now, if I look at that femur, right, so that long bone of the upper thigh, and how it sort of contacts that tibial plateau, right? So normally speaking, if I'm talking about an ACL, the greatest amount of tension in an ACL is going to be about at 30 degrees of knee flexion. So it's not there. It's actually where you got good bone-on-bone contact. It's actually about there where, you can sort of see that there's going to be greater stress on that structure, right? There's more chance for that shearing force, that skidding to occur, right? But it also places some of these other muscles that we often neglect in discussing: popliteus, plantaris, gastrocnemius, sartorius, gracilis, all of these other things. And then obviously you got your hamstrings, bicep femoris long and short head, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. So all of these things we have to factor in. And then you have your quad muscles on the front that are saying, hey, Nelly, slow down. And there's also this thing called your articularis genu, which is a muscle most people have never even heard of. And its basically sole responsibility is to actually pull that bursal sac out of the way so you can flex and extend your knee better, right? And then there's about 17 knee ligaments not commonly discussed. We won't get into that, right? Because we're kind of sort of focused on the ACL right now, the big bad boy, the biggest, thickest knee ligament of all that, obviously gets damaged. So if I'm at the greatest amount of tension on there, and let's say all of a sudden I'm looking at segmental rotations, right? Your femur has its own mass. It's also got its own center of mass. So if we all of a sudden think that that tibial plateau is the ground relative to this sliding on it, right? So if that's sliding on it, rotating on it, I guess I should use. So if it's supposed to rotate, you have all these instantaneous axes of rotation changing throughout the movement structure because the end of the femur is not a perfect circle, right? So it's got structural abnormalities. So it's not as simple as, oh, the movement was a round circle. The principles still apply though, right? Because we're functioning as one end of a bone, right? So up at the top end, you have obviously your hip joint. At the bottom end, you have your knee joint. In the middle, there's going to be that center of mass relative to this bone, right? And we're not thinking like axial, like longitudinal axis rotation. We're thinking rotation around in the sagittal plane, right? So it's going to be an axis. Most people think it's like, oh, it occurs at your hip joint. Well, that's movement of the hip. I'm thinking rotation of the individual bone. Yes, it's held together by stuff. But let's just say I take the time to loosen the stuff at my hip joint. So I negate the stability of that joint. So I reduce that ability for that, centripetal force or that perfect smooth rotation to occur, right, as I'm sort of rotating on this tibial plateau. So if I have instability at the top of the joint, I'm going to have instability that's going to be magnified at the bottom of the joint. Now, the interesting thing about my life and what I do from a designing of equipment perspective, if my alignment is off by 0.02 millimeters down over here, that's going to be magnified up here. It might actually be a centimeter off from an alignment perspective. Now, if I turn that upside down and I think about my femur relative to my hip joint, okay, so if there's instability, I change that by 2 millimeters, which is not much. 2 millimeters on a ruler, really not that much. If you're thinking about it from an inch perspective, I think it's something like 0.07 of an inch. Not much difference at all. But when I get down to my knee structure, that's going to change a lot when you think about that distance from that instability up here. So these are some things that we have to think about, right? So when we're blindly recommending, and I use the word blindly recommending, mobility exercises specific to the hip with a blatant disregard for all of the structures, that's just gross negligence. It really, really is. And we're seeing it every day on the sporting fields. It's across the board. ACL injuries are up. Achilles tendon ruptures are up. And we're talking at a professional level. What's it like with the amateur levels? Pretty bad as well. So we have to think about that. So the difference of things like that stabilize your hip, right? You got a joint capsule. Well, it's got a different thickness at the front. So the superior anterior surface of your joint capsule is different thickness than the posterior inferior structure of the joint capsule, right? You have all these different ligaments around there that you have to think about. So what happens when you elongate a ligament, right? Like let's put it on stretch consistently. Well, what happens is you actually augment that structure. You reduce its ability to function elastically wise, right? So if I have an elastic quality of something, well, if I keep pulling on it, it goes from an elastic state to a plastic state. So that means it's not going to restore as well as it should. There was a study looking at ballerinas, and what they found is they were looking for this micro hip or micro instability of the hip. And what they found, and I think it was like 47 athletes that they were looking at, and 89% of them, 89% of professional ballerinas had this micro instability of the hip. And one of the things that you have to think about is that that will lead to pain. That will lead to potential surgical intervention, right? All of these things you have to be okay with. And when we look at ballerinas who are honestly the most God-givenly talented and skilled mobility experts on the planet, next to Cirque du Soleil athletes, right? So we look at those people in that audience, they're all injured, right? 89% of them had this hip micro instability. 89%. And we're telling our youth, our young athletes, to start to do this. We want more range. We want to, like, these are prepubescent kids that we start this with. So we start augmenting this tissue from a young age. And then we wonder why later in life all of these issues occur, right? And we can take it a step further and sort of say, well, what happens when we start to age? Well, we reach peak height around 27, 28, 29 years old. And then we naturally, as a species, so the entire population of humans, start to give back height as we get into our fourth decade, right? So once we get over 30 years of age, we start to shrink a little bit. So that means that our length, tension relationships are going to start to change. And if they start to get like looser naturally, right? So if I lose the ability for a muscle to create tension, I'm going to reduce the ability to hold my joint structures together. We got to think about that. And we really have to think about, well, what are the ramifications of inhibiting muscle structure, right? Muscles we may not know the names of, right? Well, muscles, well, you may or may not know this, but if you're in the profession, you do. Muscles attached to tendons. Well, tendons attach to bone via this thing called an anthus, right? And if you don't know what an anthus is, it's a pretty interesting subject or a material. It goes from a hard bony substance to like this tendon-like substance, right? The tendon's a tendon, but that anthus, which creates that sort of contact or that attachment to the bone, can also form into what's called the periosteum, which is the outer surface of the bone. Now, the anthus connects your fascial tissue to bone. It connects your ligamentous tissue to bone, as well as your muscle structure to bone and your tendons specifically. And if we stretch that, that's probably not a good thing, because that then spins into this thing that leads to inflammation and entheitis. I believe I said that right. Just add an itis to the end of it. That just means an inflammation. But that leads to the material breakdown of bone structure, which can be the onset of things like osteoporosis. So all of these things, there's a massive cascading effect to misapplying force to our structure. And without making this sort of mastoral thesis or doctoral thesis, we need to think about this. So just to recap, if I'm going to recommend somebody stretch or do mobility training, now the goal of mobility training traditionally is not to stay within the ranges that they have. It is actually to enhance range. And once you go into the realm of enhancing range of motion where you haven't thought about everything that I've just said, you might want to step a foot or two back. Because there's one thing that you have to also consider is the length and the architectural structure of the muscles you may not know the names of, right? If you just sort of look at those hip external rotators, right? You have what's called your piriformis, obturator internus and externus, your gemini superior inferior, quadratus femoris, right? So those are 6 muscles there that are super responsible for external hip rotation and the integrity of your hip and its function. They all have different alignments, they all have different thicknesses, they all have different orientations, they all have different nerve supply. Well, some share the same nerve supply, but some are different. So meaning they all work independently and they're all going to be influenced differently at the same time. So if you're thinking, oh, I need to stretch my glutes, well, your glute's a pretty big muscle. It's obviously, it goes from the brim of the ilium all the way down to potentially coccygeal fibers across to the coccyx, right? And it attaches over to that IT band and your gluteal line and stuff like that. But it's the biggest muscle in your body, so they say. So if you're trying to stretch the biggest muscle in your body and you got 6 little muscles below it, it would be like me going in to a classroom, let's call it of kindergartners. And I guess, throwing the little kids around. It reminds me of like this episode of Seinfeld when Kramer beat up on all these little kids to win his karate title. It was pretty funny at the time. But that's kind of what you're doing. It's like you're beating up on all these little muscles that you may or not know the names of. You've reduced their ability to function at an optimal level for the goal of greater range versus just get everything really strong, right? So that's kind of my rant. So to recap, learn the physics associated with movement because if you don't realize that the head is traveling at twice the magnitude of the lower body, we need to think about this because that will, just having that understanding will dramatically reduce the risk of ACL injuries. And guess what? Non-contact ACL injuries usually occur when you change direction. So think about that. So managing the inertial loads of the upper body while transitioning and changing direction. So that's very important. Understanding that, at that contact surface instantaneously, if you add an element of skidding, you'll probably blow apart your ACL, right? We want to look at rotational forces, right? That's perfect, where you're having that sort of wheel rolling without slipping. That's perfect. Slipping is where you just spin your wheels, and that skidding is where you tear it apart, right? That's the origin and nature of an ACL rupture. Hope that guys help you understand. I was hoping this wouldn't have been a sort of a 19, 20-minute rant, but that's what it is. Sometimes you have to go a little bit deeper. You have to explore it at a level that is honest, right? We just can't sit here and go, oh, we've got to work on mobility because we think mobility is important because it's movement. No, learning how to contract muscle governs movement and mobility. Destabilizing structure that you don't know the names of means you should probably learn the names. Anyways, hope that helps. If you like the content, give it a like, give it a share. If you want to rebut, happy to talk. Think in terms of I can help you out. I certainly think about this stuff at a different level. And we can help you all because ACL tears, ruptures specifically, they're 8 times higher in women. And we got to think about why. Oh yeah, one of the other things, the people that will say there's multifactorial or it's multifactorial. Yeah, I just named a whole bunch of factors. Okay, so if we focus on isometric strength of all of these tissues. And remember, we got to get really strong here because deceleration, you're up, I think it's approaching 9 to 12 times body weight, the forces you're dealing with. So, going through a range of motion with a 2 kilo ball, yeah, it might look really good. It might be challenging. It might be, I don't know, taxing to a degree. But what it is actually doing is training you to be weak, so you cannot withstand 9 to 12 times your body weight while pivoting and cutting and turning and decelerating and jumping and running, all of these things. Anyways, rant over. Peace out. Brad, Isophit.com.